Imagine this. The most powerful man in the world, dressed in imperial silk, walks proudly through the Roman Forum. Beside him, a stunning young woman, wrapped in jewels and silence. Her name is Sporus. But not long ago, Sporus was a boy, a slave, and what Emperor Nero did to him remains one of the darkest, most disturbing stories in ancient history. A story of obsession, grief, and the way power can twist love into possession. Nero wasn't born a monster. When he became emperor at just 16, Rome celebrated. He cut taxes, built public baths, even performed on stage, something unheard of for a ruler. To the people, he was charming, generous, and unpredictable. But behind the curtain, cracks were already forming. Part of what drove Nero deeper into madness was a woman named Poppaea Sabina. Beautiful, cunning, dangerously ambitious. She became his obsession. More than love, it was fixation. Nero isolated her, guarded her, decorated Rome with her image. When he left for chariot races, he'd surround her with spies. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, not to rivals, not even to death. But obsession is a fragile thing. One night in 65 AD, after yet another argument, some say over Nero's acting career, others claim jealousy. The emperor snapped. Poppaea was pregnant, their child nearly full term. Enraged, Nero either struck her or kicked her in the stomach. She died within hours. So did their unborn baby. The man who ruled millions had just killed the one person he claimed to love most. When Poppaea died, something inside Nero fractured, not with guilt, but with delusion. He refused to have her body burned, as Roman custom demanded. Instead, he embalmed it, placed it in a jeweled tomb, and declared her divine. A goddess! Her image remained everywhere, not just in statues, but in Nero's mind. He ordered courtiers to speak of her in present tense, to leave her seat empty at banquets. The emperor, now clearly unmoored from reality, would talk to her corpse. He believed she was still listening. Rome watched in silence. No one dared question him, not when exile, or worse, followed any hint of dissent. It was during this dissent that Sporus entered the story. He was likely no more than 14 or 15. Born into slavery, freed as a child, and raised within the palace walls, trained for administrative work. Among Rome's many freedmen, Sporus had access to education, stability, and even influence. But with privilege came total vulnerability. A freedman could be elevated or destroyed at the emperor's whim. Nero noticed Sporus for one reason: his face. Several ancient sources agree Sporus resembled Poppaea, uncannily. His eyes, his bone structure, the softness of his features. It was as if Poppaea had returned, not in spirit, but in flesh. And in Nero's shattered mind, this wasn't coincidence. It was fate. It was a second chance to bring back what he had destroyed with his own hands. But what came next wasn't resurrection. It was reinvention. Nero didn't waste time. Obsessed with restoring what he'd lost, he set in motion a transformation as cruel as it was surreal. Sporus was castrated, likely against his will. A brutal act meant not just to feminize him, but to erase what he had been. Then came the wedding. Yes, a wedding. Nero staged a full imperial ceremony. He wore a veil. So did Sporus. The court was summoned, musicians played, and Rome watched as its emperor publicly married a boy he had mutilated, parading him as the empress reborn. Sporus was dressed in Poppaea's gowns, her jewelry made to speak like her, move like her, live like her. And Nero insisted everyone play along. This wasn't satire or scandal, it was state-sponsored delusion. At public events, Nero addressed Sporus as his wife. In private, he slept beside him. No one dared object. In Rome, survival meant compliance, even if it meant pretending a child in a dress was the woman the emperor had killed in a fit of rage. Some whispered that Nero had gone mad. Others just feared they'd be next. And Sporus? No records tell us what he thought. No words from him survive. But it's not hard to imagine the terror behind the silks, the loneliness, the silence, the sense of being trapped in a role written by someone else's grief and violence. Because Sporus wasn't a lover. He was a ghost, walking in a stranger's shadow. In the months that followed, Sporus became a permanent fixture at Nero's side, not as an equal, not as a partner, as an object, a living relic of the emperor's delusion. Nero paraded him through the streets, sat him beside him at state functions, and even took him along during public performances. The message was clear. Poppaea had returned, and Rome was expected to applaud. But behind the gold embroidery and theatrical rituals, there was something far darker at play, a need not just to replace what was lost, but to erase the fact that it had ever been destroyed. Nero didn't just want to forget he had killed Poppaea. He wanted to rewrite reality so it had never happened. And Sporus was the script. The court obeyed, senators bowed, generals remained silent, slaves whispered, then fell quiet. Nobody challenged the illusion. After all, challenging Nero's fantasy meant risking your head, or worse, becoming a part of it. Ancient sources say Sporus was treated with luxury, fine food, elegant clothes, access to power. But luxury means little when it's used to cage you. Behind the velvet curtain, Sporus lived as a prisoner, not in chains but in performance. His very existence was now an act of survival. Nero's obsession with control extended beyond Sporus. He had already executed his own mother. He exiled, tortured, or murdered those who questioned him. And Rome. Rome was beginning to whisper louder. The empire had seen enough madness dressed as art. But Nero wasn't done, and neither was fate. By 67 AD, Nero's grip on reality and the empire was crumbling. Rome burned, both metaphorically and literally. The fire of 64 had left thousands homeless, and though Nero blamed the Christians, whispers blamed him. He responded not with leadership, but with spectacle, building a golden palace over the ruins and performing as if applause could drown out unrest. Meanwhile, rebellions stirred. Provinces turned restless. Senators began plotting. The army, once loyal, grew tired of theatrics. And still, at Nero's side, dressed in silk and silence, stood Sporus, a constant, eerie echo of a love story that had rotted from the inside out. In the final years, Nero fled Rome, dragging Sporus with him. They moved through southern Italy, dodging conspiracies, bribing allies, abandoning all semblance of rule. He no longer trusted anyone. Even most loyal freedmen began to vanish, executed, exiled, erased. But Sporus remained, whether out of fear, lack of choice, or simply because he had nowhere else to go. He followed Nero into the final spiral. Nero, now hunted by his own government, was no longer emperor. He was a fugitive with a broken empire behind him and a ghost of his past beside him. As the Senate declared him a public enemy, as soldiers approached to arrest him, Nero asked one last favor, not of a general or a friend, but of Sporus. He asked him to die with him. The end came quietly. Cornered outside Rome, Nero hid in the villa of a loyal freedman. News arrived. The Senate had condemned him to death by beating. No trial, no ceremony, just a slow, humiliating execution, unless he acted first. But Nero, once so bold, couldn't do it. He paced the room, sobbing, begging someone, anyone, to take his life for him. No one moved. The Emperor of Rome, god to some, monster to many, stood trembling with a blade in his hands, and Sporus was there. He stayed beside Nero to the last breath, the last cry. One ancient source claims Nero looked at him and whispered, "What an artist dies in me." Another says he simply wept. But when the soldiers arrived, it was over. Nero had driven a dagger into his own throat, some say with help, some say with Sporus's hands guiding the blade. It didn't matter anymore. The emperor was dead. Rome would not mourn him. The Senate erased his name from monuments. His statues were torn down. The palace he built on ashes was seized by the state. But what of Sporus? He had outlived the man who made him a widow, a puppet, a prisoner. And in Nero's absence, the empire didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't royalty. He was a symbol of everything Rome wanted to forget, and everything it couldn't. Because Sporus had become more than a boy in a dress. He was living evidence of what power does when it stops pretending to be sane. After Nero's death, Sporus became a ghost in an empire, desperate to move on. But forgetting him wasn't so simple. He had been too visible, too close to the madness. His face had sat beside emperors. His name had passed through whispers in every corridor of power. He couldn't just disappear. And so, the empire passed him from one hand to another. First came Nymphidius Sabinus, a powerful officer of the Praetorian Guard who had helped topple Nero. He took Sporus into his household, but not as a servant. Nymphidius declared himself Nero's heir and claimed that Sporus was now his empress. Again, Sporus was dressed in silk. Again, he played a part written by someone else's delusion. The nightmare had not ended. Nymphidius treated Sporus as a trophy, a living extension of Nero's myth, as if owning the boy who wore Poppeia's face gave him legitimacy. But Nymphidius overplayed his hand. His ambition outpaced his support. Within months, he was assassinated by his own men, and Sporus was handed off again. He became a possession of Otho, another short-lived emperor, and once a close friend of Nero's. Otho, too, had known Poppaea, and perhaps saw in Sporus not a companion, but a relic, a reminder, a mirror to a time of glamour and decay. History doesn't say what Sporus thought. No letters, no voice, only silence. Because in Rome, he was never really a person. He was a role. The empire rolled on. One emperor after another rose and fell in bloody succession. Otho, who had briefly taken Sporus into his court, ruled just 3 months before taking his own life. Civil war raged. Rome no longer needed actors. It needed survivors. And somehow, Sporus kept surviving. But he wasn't free. He couldn't simply disappear into the crowd. Too many had seen him in silks and jewels. Too many knew what he represented. He was a symbol of everything the empire had tried to bury: the madness of Nero, the humiliation of a boy turned doll, and the silence that let it happen. In time, Sporus found himself at the mercy of one last man, Vitellius.